If you play the Caro Kann defense or are looking to start playing the Caro Kann, the minority attack is something that you must understand. And based on a video I released a couple of days ago talking about lots of key concepts in the Caro Kann, I had quite a few comments talking about the minority attack and the fact that they don't quite understand it or have never really heard anybody explain it before. So this video is dedicated purely to the minority attack. This idea can also be used in other openings. In this particular pawn structure, this is known as the Carlsbad pawn structure, and it arises from an exchange Caro Kann. So it'd start with something like e4, d4, e4, c6, d4, d5, and white takes on d5, black takes back. This pawn will end up coming to c3 and this pawn to e6, and you get the same structure. This is a position that is quite a normal position in the exchange Caro Kann, where basically both sides have developed almost all of their pieces. Obviously, the white dark squared bishop could do with coming out at some point. And the plans for both sides, because of the difference in pawn structure, where white doesn't have an e-pawn, white's plan is basically to use the e5 square as a launch pad for a kingside attack. And for black, because we don't have a c pawn, right? We are trying to use our b and a pawns to go after white's c, b, and a pawns. Because we have 2 queenside pawns, white has 3 queenside pawns. It's known as the minority attack. Now, the concept behind the minority attack, let me show you if I go to setup position. If we can basically trade off the b and a pawns, right? So let's say we get rid of the b and a pawns from this position, right? And I don't know, let's just put this bishop on d2, for example. This is a equal position according to the engine. Now, the point of this idea, this structure, is if we can successfully use the minority attack to trade off the a and b pawns, white is going to be left with this incredibly weak pawn on c3. And we can use our open c file to go after that c pawn. If that c pawn falls, endgames will always favor us because the d4 pawn will be completely undefended, right? Now compare that to our structure, where our kingside and central pawns are all together and defending each other, right? As opposed to on the white side, where they are split because they do not have an e-pawn. I'm going to take you through some games that I've played online and demonstrate using these ideas with, again, the crucial concept, the whole point being that if we leave white with this structure, it is going to be incredibly easy to pick up the c3 pawn at some point. And even imagine, right, let's say we only trade off the let's say we only trade our b pawn for, sorry, what am I trying to say? No, not trade it off. Let's say this b pawn gets to c4, right, as an example, which is often the case. So let's say the a pawns come off the board, or let's say the a pawns are still on the board, and we have some structure like this, which I've had before, and we actually, I think, have a game that I'm going to show you where this type of thing occurs, where, yes, the pawns are equal. We have the same number of pawns. We can often get a pawn on c4 by bringing a knight via a5 into c4 and having white trade and us taking back with the b pawn. So this is not unrealistic at all. And we can use the open b file to target the b2 pawn in the same way that if these pawns were off the board, we could use the open c file to target the c3 pawn. It's the exact same concept, where because we have fewer pawns on the queen side, we can actually try to target the white pawns using the open files. So let's jump into the games. Let's jump in. So this one, I think, is a bullet game. So, you know, the moves are not going to be perfect by any means, but that's not the point. The point is that we are going to see the minority attack in action. So we have normal development. Queen b3, queen c8 is a slight deviation from normal opening theory, but it's not that big a deal. Knight a3, pawn a6, knight f3. And pawn a6 is kind of the springboard to go pawn b5. I was also trying to stop the knight from coming to b5 and being annoying, but again, the opening itself isn't particularly important. Point is, we have this structure, which is known as the Carlsbad structure. We have the open c-file, and we need to start launching our pawns down the board. When I was doing my video a couple days ago as well, in talking about Caro Kann concepts, which again, I think was a really useful video, I spoke a lot about pawn breaks, and the fact that in the Caro Kann, pawn breaks are so crucial. So, for example, let's say white just does nothing, just starts shuffling his rook around. If we can do something like pawn b4, right? If we can make this pawn break happen, and we get something like cb4, ab4, and, I don't know, knight b1. For example, here we have bishop c2 forking the queen and the rook. But let's imagine we didn't have that, and we had a position like this, right? Here, material is equal, but we have an open a-file, and this white pawn is going to struggle to defend itself, right? Even if the pawn tries to trade itself off by coming to a3 or something. So let's say something like, I don't know, rook b8. I know that's hanging a rook, so let's just put the bishop on e3, pawn on h6, and the pawn on a3. Something like this, right? And we do something like ba3, queen b7, rook b7, and b takes a3. This pawn is defended. We're not going to win it immediately. We could take the knight and take the pawn, sure, but let's say we're not going to do that. Again, this is conceptual. The concept is, all endgames favor black. Now, the material is equal, and you might think that, oh, well, white has an outside passed pawn, so surely white should be better. Well, not really, because this a-pawn, we should be able to round up relatively easily because we have the open files for our rooks. Also, this d4 pawn is a big weakness because we have gotten rid of the c3 pawn because of the exchange on the b4 square, right? And again, there is no e-pawn to defend the d4 pawn, whereas our pawns are all nice and safe, defending each other, right? That's kind of the idea. So this game continued rook e1, pawn b5, knight h4, bishop e4, pawn f3. I didn't play perfect moves, but again, this is a bullet game. But we have this structure where we have a nice, solid, compact kingside and central pawn structure, and we want to try and break apart white's queenside structure. We go knight b6, queen c2, pawn b4. And pawn b4 is a really, really useful move because, well, for a start, it can't be taken because the queen hangs. And you often get pins down the c-file against the queen on c2. That's a very common theme. So my opponent went knight d2, queen c6, applying more pressure to the c-file. Again, it still can't be taken because the queen hangs. Bishop d3. Here, I should have taken on c3, with the idea being after b takes c3, we actually have a tactical way to win a pawn with bishop a3, and after the rook moves, we can take on c3. But it's actually far stronger not to do that because there's knight b1 ideas. But instead, we can just go for a move like knight a4, apply even more pressure, and this pawn can't really advance to c4 because let's say white doesn't lose material here. Let's imagine white doesn't lose any material. Well, the d4 pawn still sucks. It's just a target. It's a clear target, and we blockade the square on d5, so it can't trade itself off, right? So I went pawn a5 in this position. Again, if my opponent takes, then here I'm not winning a queen. It's defended by the bishop, but I can play something like queen c2, rook c2, bishop c2, and ab4, where firstly, we have gotten rid of the c-pawn, which was defending the pawn on d4, so d4 is now weak. And we have given ourselves an open file to target the a2 pawn. So let's say white defends with a move like bishop to b3. And we go, I mean, the engine here suggests knight to e8, I think, because it wants to go bishop f6 and target to the d4 pawn, which is a strange move, but understandable. So let's say knight e8, rook c1, bishop f6 for the sake of argument, bishop e5. Would we take this bishop? No, because then we put white's pawns together. We do get a passed d pawn, but conceptually, we want this pawn to remain a weakness on d4, right? And let's say the engine suggests bishop g5 here, which is a bit strange. But the point is, we have pressure on a2, we have pressure on d4, so endgames should favor us, right? In the game, my opponent went g4, which was a bit wild. Rook a7, not the best move, but I'm obviously trying to triple up. Oh, sorry, I wasn't trying to triple up. I was trying to go rook b7 because this bishop was preventing me from coming to b8. I think that was the idea. Here, bishop e5, bc3, bc3, bishop a3, hitting the rook. And after the rook moves, I can take on c3, and I am just winning, really. Because let's say queen c3, rook c3, rook b6, rook b3. I'm only at one pawn. So you would think, oh, it should only be -1. But again, structurally, I'm so much better. Granted, f3 has been artificially weakened because of g4. But d4 is a weakness. Our bishop has a very nice square on b4 to go to. We're up a pawn. We have the c file that we can try to use ourselves. And if we win this a2 pawn, we're going to have a passed pawn. Even if we don't win the a2 pawn, even if these pawns were to come off the board, we're up a pawn and white has a weak d4 pawn. So after bishop a3, my opponent resigned. This is kind of like a perfect showcase of the minority attack in the Caro, or he ran out of time, I think. Yeah, he ran out of time, but might as well have resigned. c3 is just such a major weakness because we facilitated this trade and opened up lines. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's move on to the next game. So, again, exchange Caro Kann, normal sorts of moves. Again, these openings are not necessarily perfect. This is another bullet game, not the point. Castles, castles, h6, bishop h4, and we launch the pawns forward. Now, here, my opponent has a very strong move, knight to e5, and I'm in a bit of trouble because of all of the pressure in the center of the board. But, again, it's bullet. Pawn a4. Now, knowing what we know so far, in this position, what should we do? What should we do? The engine doesn't mind taking on a4, but personally, I think that that is not in the spirit of the position. I think pawn b4 is in the spirit of the position. The engine will call this an inaccuracy because of this knight to e5 idea. But if knight to e5 wasn't a thing, then this would be perfect, right? Again, knight e5 is more tactical in nature. Pawn b4 is a positional idea, which is what I'm trying to teach you. So if something like cb4, knight b4, hitting the bishop, which is a very common idea, we have this open b file to work with, and this b2 pawn is simply a backwards pawn. Positionally, white is in a lot of trouble. Let's say he saves the bishop with bishop to f1. Here, the engine wants pawn g5 because of these knight to e5 ideas, I think. But let's say we play a move like pawn a5 in this position. Positionally, we are winning, right? Well, or much better. Tactically, white has ideas, but we're talking positional play here. Our a pawn dominates these a and b pawns. Our one pawn, the minority, dominates the two a and b pawns, the majority, because this pawn can't come to b4 because we take it. Therefore, this a pawn is forcing white to give us an open file. Now, in some lines, this bishop will be able to come to b5 to try and block up the b file, sure. But we would obviously look to trade off the bishop with a move like bishop to d7. And let's imagine something like take-take happened. Let's forget about this concept of bishop f6. Let's say something like knight c3, or I'm trying to find a way to make this really obvious. Let's say like queen d2, knight e4, queen d1, something like this. Well, we're going to put a rook on b8, and we're going to go after b2. Very simple. And the b pawn can never advance to b5, where it would be defended. So it's not a problem that we have a 2v1. It's actually in favor of us. And again, once this c3 pawn has been traded off, d4 is super weak. Anyway, the game continued with knight bd2. I take on c3. And here again, we have a position where we have the open c file. We have traded off the b pawns. And that means that c3 can't be defended by a pawn, which makes it very, very weak. And as long as we can stop it from coming to c4, we're okay. Although, even if the pawn gets to c4, so here I went bishop d7. Let's say white went pawn c4 here, and we get something like take-take. Well, d4 is a major weakness. We control the square in front of the pawn, right? As long as we don't let it advance to d5, where it can trade itself off, then it will be a perennial weakness because it cannot be defended by another pawn. Whereas our pawn structure, granted, maybe our a6 pawn is weak. I would hesitate to say it's a weak pawn. I think it's okay because, I mean, white has an a4 pawn as well. But if these pawns were to come off the board, then black is clearly better. Clearly better. Anyway, the game continued bishop d7, not the best move, but alright. Knight f1, bishop e7, bishop d2, knight a5. And I'm trying to go after this c4 square. So queen d3, knight e4, stopping any checkmate ideas. My opponent sacrificed the exchange. I went pawn f5, blocking the attack. And here, the best move, which I didn't play, again, this is a very quick game, was rook ac8. Simply saying to white, how on earth are you going to defend your c3 pawn? How? And the only real viable way to do it is queen d2. When knight c4 occurs, let's say queen e2, and we just pile on the pressure. Like, we can rotate the bishop into d5, let's say something like bishop c6, knight d2, knight d2, knight d2, bishop d5, something like this. I think c4 can actually be played, although maybe you can't take because of this. So queen g5 is strong because after take, the knight is incredibly weak. So let's say c4 can't be played. Let's say something like a5, I don't know. Obviously that hangs c3. So, I don't know, maybe you defend with a move like queen to e3. We can just pile on pressure. We can pile on pressure, or we can even offer a queen trade and just try to maintain our pressure, something like rook a3. We are up in exchange here, bear in mind, because white sacked the exchange. But this pawn is just such a big weakness. That's the whole point. Anyway, I went knight c4, bishop b3, queen d6. And the game got a bit out of hand for white after giving up several pieces and giving me a queen. But the point is, this positional idea of trading the pawns by playing pawn to b4 and pawn takes c3, b takes c3 is crucial. Now, this wouldn't quite work the same if, let's say, I don't know, rook e2 or something. Here, if knight c3, sorry, pawn c3, knight c3, the target would then become the b2 pawn, right? That would now be the target, and d4 would still be a weakness because it isn't defended by another pawn. Let's jump into another game. I'm really trying to drill this idea down because I don't think a lot of you guys watching actually understand what the minority attack is and why it's useful. Because if you don't do anything in this type of position, if you just sit back, white will attack you on the king side. He'll play knight e5, pawn f4, something like castles, rook f3, rook g3, maybe pawn g4, pawn g5, and the white pieces will come after you on the king side. You need to attack on the queen side. Otherwise, you're going to get steamrolled. Right? That's a big lesson in the exchange variation. You need to understand that. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. My opponent castles, pawn a6, rook fe1, pawn b5. Again, same idea. We're going for pawn b4. You could even throw in rook fc8 in this position. And if white tries to continue with the plan of knight to e5, whoops, knight takes d4. Pin on the c-file. Again, another very common idea in the minority attack. Very common. So anyway, pawn b5, pawn a3, knight a5. It would have been better to go rook fc8, because then I have threats, and the white queen probably has to move, and then I can continue with knight to a5 if I so choose. Some people even go for a move like pawn b4 in these types of lines. I have seen it several times, and I wouldn't recommend a move like knight c4, personally, because then we have to put a pawn on the c-file, which means that we can't really access c3, although we can go knight to d5. So I would personally recommend just dropping the knight back and basically saying, okay, defend then. Like, find a way to defend. You can play this cool move rook e3, where if I take, you have bishop h7 picking up the rook. But let's say rook c1, for example. Realistically, this is going to be very difficult for white. He'd have to go for a4. That would have to be the idea. So, I don't know, something like take. Engine suggests pawn h6, and then after pawn a4, queen c6. And if we get this trade, and let's say the rooks come off the board, we have this clamp on c4. We have a lot of pressure on c3. And again, all endgames favor black because of the pawn structure. Again, Knight a5, knight e5, knight c4. My opponent takes on c4, and here I do have to take on c4. But by initiating this trade, which I spoke about earlier in the video, which is why I've included this game, we open up the b file against the b2 pawn. And as you'll see as the game continues, rook a b8, and I just double up on the b file. And white has to find a way to defend. And if this pawn is ever moved, we of course take en passant. And game over. These pawns are super weak, and we're up a pawn, and we've got a passed pawn. My opponent goes queen c1, we go queen b6, and the pawn just can't be defended. The pawn is lost. Quite simply. And then I go on to win the game. I think my opponent played some interesting moves, but again, we get into this endgame where black is simply better. We are up 2 pawns, granted, but the point is we have this very solid structure. White's pawns are split. That's the whole point. So, yeah, in this position, it's just game over, and my opponent resigns. Another game. Another minority attack, another exchange Caro Kann. This concept is so important, and I hope I'm getting it through to you. If you have any questions, drop them down in the comments, please. Again, this is a very similar position. These positions are very, very similar. These knights are normally set up like this. The rook is on e1. e5 is the idea for white. This bishop is on this very nice diagonal on d3. This is all very normal, right? Pawn b5, knight e5, knight a5, queen c2. And again, it's the same idea, knight c4. If my opponent takes the knight, what do we do? What do we do? You should know the answer to this now. B takes. Bishop moves. Where's our target? It's on b2. b2 is the target. If this pawn moves, let's say bishop g6, knight g6, hg6, and I don't know, let's say white tries to get rid of the weakness. Well, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that? I think we should take. Personally, that's the move that I would want to play here. And after a move like rook fc8, we are applying pressure to the white pawns. And if the pawn tries to advance up the board, what does that do? Well, it weakens the d pawn. So d takes. And d4 is going to hang. So my opponent doesn't bite. He goes pawn to a4. Rook fb8, ab5, ab5. Now, has the minority attack been executed? Have we achieved the goal of the minority attack? We've opened up the A file, and we've traded a set of pawns. Have we done it? No. No, we haven't. Because, where is the base of the white pawn chain? On b2. Do we have an open B file? No. No. So, have we achieved the goal? No. We need to open the B file. Or, we need to go pawn b4. And again, if white takes, we open up the b file. d4 is weak, b2 is weak. Brilliant. We have good access to the pawn. If we go b4 and white doesn't take, we want to take. And after b takes, c3 is weak. And then we can use the open c file against the c pawn. The minority attack is not achieved. If white plays a move like b4, what's the idea? Well, again, we're going to use the open c file against the weak c3 pawn. These ideas repeat. Okay, knight b3. Bishop g6. Again, I'm not saying this is a perfect game. In this position, I have a tactical win. After rook a1, and knight e5, d e5, queen c5, ef6, gf6, I'm up a pawn. And again, b4 is on the way. Again, b4 is on the way. The minority attack is still the whole idea. Let's say queen d2. Pawn b4 is not the best move because there's queen f4 with a fork. But the point is, we open up the lines against the white pawns, right? Here, the base of the pawn chain is on b2. We need to open up the b file. If white doesn't take us and plays, I don't know, king h1, then we take, and then we make c3 the target. Even when pieces come off the board, the minority attack is still one of the main ideas, right? Pawn structure is so important in so many openings, particularly in the Caro Kann, right? And so the plans of the position are often dictated by the pawn structure, which means that the minority attack is so often the idea in these Caro Kann exchange positions. And often in other openings, it's also the case. This is just the one that I know best. So anyway, I missed the tactical idea. Rook e5, knight d2, not the point. Take, 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 take. It's queen and rook versus queen and rook. queen b3. I'm not saying I'm playing the best moves in this position. And I go queen c4. Question is, can white take my queen? What do you think? Can white take? Well, if take, is white losing? No. I mean, material is equal. White should probably be able to hold on. Is black better? Yes. Why? Well, we have the open b file, and the b pawn can never move because we take en passant. So let's say something like, I don't know, rook e2. I don't know, rook a1, king a2, and rook b1. Well, we're dominating the position. This pawn can never move, and it's a permanent weakness. The base of our pawn chain is on f7. That is incredibly easy to defend. So we're just better, right? Structurally, we are better. Maybe this game ends in a draw, but it would be very hard for white to draw this, in my opinion. Anyway, game continues. Queen e7, queen b3, rook e2, and here we have a tactical win with queen d1 check picking up the rook. That was the trap I was setting. In this position, the engine wants to give away the b2 pawn and look for counterplay against f7. But realistically, even here, black should be the one that wins this. Let's say this queen isn't... Well, even if this queen is defending... Okay, but let's say it isn't. Let's say cb4 and queen takes. Let's say this isn't hanging. Let's imagine, I don't know, something like this position. We're up a pawn, but again, the d4 pawn is a massive, massive target because we've removed the defender of it using our pawn break. Like I said, my opponent blundered tactically, though. Last game. If you're still here, thank you so much, and I hope that you are understanding the ideas. Again, another exchange, Caro Kann, the same sort of thing. Rook e1, pawn a6. Again, this knight wants to come to e5. This is all very standard. Queen c2, rook fc8. In this position, I do play rook fc8 because after knight to e5, there is knight takes d4. Can't be taken because of this, and we are hitting the queen. Normal idea. So my opponent goes pawn a3, stopping the knight coming to b4. Because even if my opponent, I don't know, says, okay, king h1, you can't take this because my knight takes. Knight b4 is still a problem. Because I'm going to get rid of your strong bishop, go bishop g6 with tempo, and I'm still going to do the minority attack. Like pawn b5, pawn a5, pawn b4. I'm still going to do it. My opponent goes pawn a3, pawn b5, pawn b4. Now, this is slightly different, of course. We're not going to be able to play pawn a5, pawn b4 like we normally would, right? Ripping open the position. Instead, my opponent goes pawn b4. Now, what changes? Well, a4 is a move we have to constantly be on the lookout for. Because if my opponent can execute a4, we could be in trouble. Because maybe b5 gets weak after this exchange, right? But c3 can never move. As long as this pawn stays on b5, clamping down on c4, we should win the c-pawn in the long run. I went pawn a5, which is slightly inaccurate because of bishop takes b5, and after ab4, ab4. I think I thought I had knight b4, and you can't take because of this. But, of course, there's rook a8, and if I take the queen, then I have to give up my queen anyway to defend my king. So it didn't quite work, but my opponent, I don't think, capitalized on it. Oh, sorry, no, I wanted to take on a1 and then play knight b4. Here, there is queen a4, which is apparently winning for white. And, again, I mess up the position a bit. But my opponent doesn't capitalize. Again, this is tactically. I'm talking from a positional standpoint for this video. Where we have this structure where we have traded off the A and B pawns, right? This is exactly what I was speaking about at the start of the video. And positionally, we are better because c3 can't advance and it's a constant target. And if c3 does manage to advance, or we take it, then d4 is going to be a problem. Here, knight e5, game continues, queen c7, dc4, knight c4. White trades off the c-pawn, but the d4 pawn is still a big problem, and it can't advance. So game continues. I'm kind of looking for trades here, because I feel like the endgame should be winning. Even though material is equal, this is so much easier to play with black, because of how weak d4 is, right? Here my opponent offers a queen trade, and this looks like a dead draw. Theoretically, it is a dead draw, but my 1900 rated opponent, who is better than the majority of you watching, not meant as an insult, it's meant to show you the power of this pawn structure, Ends up blundering with knight to f4 check, and I'm picking up the g2 pawn because his king wanders over to d3, trying to defend the weak d4 pawn. Now, did my opponent have to blunder that? No, he could have gone pawn g3, and the game would have continued, and I would have tried to poke and prod, and maybe it ends up in a draw, but maybe I win. But yeah, my opponent gives me the g2 pawn, and bad turns to worse as more pawns get weak, and we advance the king, take the d4 pawn, which is weak, and then we go on to win the game. Not really important, but obviously this position is completely winning for black. I hope this video demonstrates the minority attack to you very nicely, right? I really do hope this was a useful video. If you want to see the other Caro Kann video that I've been referencing throughout this video, where I go over 6 very important lessons in the Caro Kann, while analyzing some games from my subscribers that demonstrate them very well, check out the video up here. And if you want to see other games on my channel featuring the Caro Kann Defense, most of them with me playing the Caro Kann live and talking through my thought process as I play, check out the playlist down there. Thank you so much for watching. I really do hope this was useful, and I'll see you in one of those videos.